Hey, I was watching a video here on YouTube, as I do, by someone called Jones105639. I've put a link to the video to the right of the screen here. Jones poses some interesting questions about the relationship between God and love. People sometimes raise questions about whether some of the seemingly wrathful, angry acts attributed to God in the Bible are consistent with the proposition that God is loving, or as 1 John 4:8 puts it, God is love. Among the questions Jones asks are the following.
Have you ever actually met a loving God? Do you know what a loving God does? What examples do you have to compare a loving God with? Or are these your own concepts that you're making up in your mind as you go?
Excellent questions all. It seems to me the Bible provides us with a definition of what love is. For the next several minutes, I'll work with that biblical definition of love, and I hope answer the questions Jones posed. One needn't be an avid reader of the Bible to be familiar with the definition of love offered in the New Testament. If one's been to a few weddings or commitment ceremonies, one is likely to have heard the definition read. It's found in the 13th chapter of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Love, according to this definition, is patient, and love is kind. Love is not jealous. Love does not brag. Love is not arrogant. Love does not act unbecomingly. It doesn't seek its own. It's not provoked. It takes no account of wrongs. It doesn't rejoice in unrighteousness. It rejoices with the truth. It bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. Love, Paul tells us, never fails. It's impossible to know whether Paul intended this list to be exhaustive. However, it's clear that his definitional enumeration contains the necessary, if not sufficient conditions, for a being to be considered loving. If 1 John 4:8's unequivocal proclamation that God is love, love itself is true, then it must also be true that God always and only exhibits the qualities set forth in the biblical definition of love. That, in response to one of Jones's questions, is what a loving God, the God who is love itself, would do. If God does not always and only exhibit these qualities, then it doesn't make sense to say God is love. He may be any number of other things, but love isn't one of them. Time does not permit the exploration of each of the characteristics or conditions of love set forth in 1 Corinthians. Fortunately, however, since it's proposed that God is love, it shouldn't matter which of the characteristics or conditions are examined. God must satisfy all of them. Let's look at a few. Okay, here it looks like we have a problem already. Take a look at Exodus 34:14. You shall not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. We have three biblical propositions here that cannot all be true. Number one, God is love. Number two, love is not jealous. And number three, God's name is jealous. God cannot be love if one of God's names is something that love is not. Jealous is one of the things love is not. Another problem. Take a look at Deuteronomy 9:7. Remember this and never forget how you provoked the Lord your God to anger in the desert. That's not all. Judges 2:12. They provoked the Lord to anger. 1 Kings 14:9. God speaking. You have provoked me to anger and thrust me behind your back. There are almost 30 passages in the Bible that talk about God being provoked. Additionally, the scriptures offer many incidents of God being provoked, some of them quite disturbing. For example, there is the notorious story of the prophet Elisha being teased by some boys in the second chapter of 2 Kings. Basically, the boys tease Elisha about his baldness, and in punishment for this teasing, God sends along 2 hungry bears to tear the boys to shreds. Cue the choir. Again, we have 3 biblical propositions here that cannot all be true. Number 1, God is love. Number 2, love is not provoked. And number 3, God is provoked. The biblical definition of love says, love is not provoked. Since God is provoked, God cannot be love. Unbecoming is defined as not in accord with the standards implied by one's character or position. Unbecoming conduct is not proper, using proper in its classical sense, to a particular person or thing. Although the proposition God is love has already been called into serious question here, let's use it as a launching point for a look at part of the biblical story of Job. The biblical writers were quite fond of describing God as a reliable protector of his own. For example, Psalm 36:7, "How precious is your unfailing love, O God! Both high and low among people find refuge in the shadow of your wings." Psalm 9:10, "You, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you." Job no doubt believed all of this about God. The book that bears his name tells us Job was blameless, upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. The book even has God boasting about Job in the very same terms. "My servant Job, there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning from evil." Despite all this, the second God is challenged about Job. Challenged by Lucifer, it must be emphasized. God turns Job, as well as everyone and everything Job has, over to Satan. Job 1:12, "All that Job has is in your power." Job 2:6, "Job is in your power." In his excellent book, God, a Biography, Jack Miles aptly describes this as follows: "The Lord is shown to be susceptible to the suggestions of a celestial being, hostile to a human being." In other words, God is tempted by Satan to give up one of God's own for purposes of a wager, a bet. And God does it. In the process, Job loses just about everyone and everything he had, and is driven into a state of profound bewilderment. Cue the choir. Yet again, we have 3 biblical propositions that cannot all be true. Number 1, God is love. Number 2, love does not act unbecomingly. And number 3, God acts unbecomingly. God fails to fulfill a third element of the biblical definition of love. As he is described in the Bible, God fails always and only to satisfy all of the elements of the biblical definition of love. Therefore, God cannot be love.